Hi, and welcome to an Adventure the Ostentatious vlog with me, Austin Shock. This one is in correlation with the blog that is all about the language continuum. Specifically, though, this one is going to be a little bit different, for you see, it's going to go into the difference between having yourself a dialect and having yourself an accent. And one of the reasons I'm going into this with such a fine voice is that you see there is a little show upon the Netflix that my mother, my dear sweet mother, she had me watch with her a few episodes of known as Dairy Girls. And the thing with the Dairy Girls is that even though they're speaking English, I can't understand a single thing that they're saying unless I'm having the subtitles on or watching it very, very closely, or unless I'm getting used to it. So basically, what you have is you have a great big difference between a dialect and an accent. A dialect is basically another language. It just doesn't quite have the political force in order to make it the majority norm. An accent, oh, see, the thing with an accent is that you're saying kind of the same words, like you're following the same syntax and all that jazz, but the difference is that you got yourself a different way of pronouncing all the sounds and things. Because the thing is, you might use the words a little bit different way, but at the end of the day, you're still speaking the same language, and it's still something that's perfectly understandable. It still follows all those same kinds of rules and things, but it sounds very different because I mean like this is it's a kind of New Yorker, but it's not really New York. It's like a coffee and all that jazz. But the thing is, it's not really New York. It's just sort of my own interpretation of what New Yorker sounds like. And on the other hand of things, you might have yourself a little bit of a southern accent. And the thing with the southern accent is that it does have a little bit of a drawl, but a lot of people, especially up here in the Pacific Northwest, tend to overplay their accent quite a bit when it's in the South, and they sound like this, which you might do like, oh, I have myself my banjo and so the thing with the accent right there is that it sounds a little bit different, but it still follows the same basic syntaxes. Now, as I am an honest folk, I'm not going to go into some of the different kinds of American dialects that we have. The most famous, I would argue, of which is that which is spoken by some members of the African American community and grew out of as a lot of their slave communities. But the question there is that a dialect or is that a creole? So a dialect is a form of the language itself. It's kind of like that whole Spanish could be considered a dialect of Latin, same with French, Walloon, Romanian, Portuguese, Italian, Sicilian, etc., 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 etc. A Creole, however, is a mixing of two languages together, and there are quite a few different Creoles. In fact, I would argue that Spanglish is a Creole for my basic understanding of pues los dos, el lenguaje y la definición de la palabra. But it also depends on how often it's used, because Creole can just be used to get by, but if it's doing that, then it's really more of a pidgin language, which is a simplified version. Now, English does have an international pidgin. In fact, a lot of native speakers have a really hard time when they're in an international meeting and they're using English as the common language because a lot of the other people are going to be using the pidgin, which cuts out a lot of the features that we have in English. It cuts out all those different phrases, those similes, metaphors that we tend to use a lot more often than people realize, which really changes the language and makes those people harder to understand, whereas everyone else uses this much more simplified version, which is much easier to understand and can actually sometimes put native speakers of all things at a disadvantage. So, once again, this goes back to, well, now we're having even more layers. So we have the accent, which is the same basic language, just all the sounds are said a little bit differently, and a little bit of the syntax is different. Then you have a dialect where there's enough, I would argue, enough of a vocabulary difference. For example, American English versus British English. There's enough of a vocabulary difference there to make it a different dialect as well as a different accent. Things like calling sweatshirts jumpers, or instead of saying the trunk of the car, it is the boot of the car, as one thing. Then you have the difference between a Creole and a Pidgin, where a Creole is kind of two languages smashing themselves together, as I understand it, in order to really make something that is a means of communication, whereas a pidgin is a very simplified version of a language that is used, once again, for that communication piece. All this is going on to say that languages are really fun, but really, really, really complicated. And while, yes, there is the quote unquote standard version of a language that is the most accepted version of the language, it is not the only version, nor is it the only version that has inherent value, inherent worth. A lot of times in history, what you'll find is that the standard language is the quote unquote prestige version of the language, where people who speak that particular version are seen as fancier or are seen as better educated, and with that caveat, are seen as smarter than the people who stick with their more vulgar, to use the Latin term, version of the language. And there's so much to unpack there, but if you actually get down and study the languages, what you'll find is that they can sometimes have more nuance than the standard language. And so that whole idea that the standard inherently has this prestige or elite quality to it does not hold water. Anyway, this is just my little take on a little bit different form of language than the continuum idea, and I will see you all later. Be amazing.